Public notice to Stephen T. Mnuchin and the Joint Chiefs, 1, 2, 3. March 25, 2020 by Anna von Reitz. The devil mirrors everything, so that the world of illusion can be easily mistaken for the actual world. No wonder, then, that his children, the central bankers, do the same thing. It's like bees building a hive for them. They create mirrors the same way they create idols, with much the same effect, to fool and confuse other people, while protecting and enriching themselves. It is simple enough to see if you are looking. Back in 1937, the Pope's municipal government agreed with the Queen's Territorial Commonwealth government, which is also ultimately owned by the Pope, because the Queen acts as his overseer of the Commonwealth, to construct such a mirrored government structure in America. They provided for it with a written agreement called the Declaration of Interdependence of the Governments in the United States. This document unwittingly admits that these are foreign governments in the United States, and then goes on to describe their continuity of government scheme, in which they divvy up the payola. You may have heard those words in recent newscasts, continuity of government, coming out of Washington, D.C. I have. Both Foreign Governmental Services Corporations U.S., Inc. and USA, Inc. agreed to set up parallel, that is, mirror image, governmental structures and departments, and of course, both agreed to charge the American states and people for this service. That is, they agreed to double dip for their mutual benefit. And why not? They both ultimately belong to the Pope anyway. They might as well collaborate, right? So, that is how we come to have the U.S. Department of Labor and the United States Department of Labor. The IRS and the Internal Revenue Service. The DoD and the Department of Defense. See the shtick in action? We have, and have paid for, at least two of everything. In some cases, like the U.S. Treasury, Department of the Treasury, Department of the United States Treasury, Department of the United States Treasury, Department of the U.S. Treasury, Department of the U.S. Treasury. Well, you see my point, we have paid for many more than two of everything. Their excuse for this is to provide continuity of government, but it is actually necessary only when one or the other goes bankrupt for the purpose of escaping their own debt and shifting the burden of their debt to their presumed sureties, their hapless, erstwhile, apparently unrepresented absentee employers, the American states and people. While the cats have been away, the mice have indeed played. But now, we're back, and having found ourselves so far disrespected and disserved by our purported trustees and our public employees, we have lifted our hands and declared and corrected our actual political status records and have assembled our States of the Union and staffed our unincorporated Federation of States, and we have taken the field and said, whoa. Not only that, we have observed that, 1, we have never been informed of all these provisions being taken for us by our employees, 2, we have an explicit contract and stipulations in place, the respective constitutions, which they have no right or reason to change or abrogate, 3, any pretense that our government has ever ceased to function simply because the Confederation ceased to function is obvious bunk, 4, we do not stand as sureties for the debts of our employees apart from the services approved by the constitutions, 5, we have not mortgaged our land or soil in their favor, 6, they have no authority to take any mortgage or hypothecate any debt against our property interests, 7, the rules, regulations, codes, and statutes of legislation apply to government workers, and not to us, 8, the only law pertaining to our relationship with any federal employee, whether a direct employee of one of the municipal or territorial corporations, or an employee of one of their franchises operating as a state of state, is the appropriate constitution, as that constitution existed in 1860. There has been no consensual agreement otherwise. They have used and abused our credit apart from our consent, and for purposes never intended, which renders their actions and claims that we are standing as sureties for them and their debts invalid. These are odious debts, Mr. Mnuchin, and are odious debts on the face of them. We don't even have a contract with any incorporated entities doing business as the Municipal Corporation of the District of Columbia, the United States, Inc. or the United States of America, etc. Our contracts are with the actual principals, the Holy See, Westminster, and the British monarch. These principals are 100% responsible for the actions, debts, and failure of these chartered entities to perform according to their contracts and obligations, and all the harm physical, fiscal, and economic inflicted upon our persons and property by these foreign incorporated service organizations operating on our shores. So now they are scurrying around making preparations for one of the sets of departments and agencies to disappear under a cloud of bankruptcy protection that should never be allowed. The municipal set of bad actors is being liquidated, because, of the two, it is closest to home, the Pope, and clearly was never allowed by the constitutional agreements. The territorial government has at least some claim to have been granted a custodial role with respect to some of our property, and was granted some ability to establish federal arsenals and similar military-related facilities on our land and soil. It is also charged with providing us with physical protection under mutual defense agreements. So now, the territorial government comes forward to receive the debts of the municipal government as credit owed to the actual American states and people. A shell game within a shell game, unless the assets are actually returned to the American states and people. What you are seeing is a flip-flop, to different faces of the same papal coin. This version is run by the Queen as the Pope's overseer of the Commonwealth, and is not an expression of the American government at all, though it is under contract to serve us in good faith. Thus, you will no longer see references to the President of the United States, but you will see references to the President of the United States of America. The actual and factual government of this country, vested in the people, woke up in 1998 and has pursued correction and recoupment ever since. A plot by our employees to mischaracterize American babies as United States citizens, territorials, and as citizens of the United States, municipals, both, was discovered. It follows the anti-Reformation playbook published by King James Chapter 1, entitled The Bounty Book. This blackguard operation was implemented via the use of false registrations and semantic deceit, resulting in the issuance of birth certificates and the human trafficking of millions of American babies' identities into foreign jurisdictions, and their subjugation under foreign law, as if they had been conscripted into the French Foreign Legion. This is crime against humanity and is forbidden as a capital crime by both the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions, as well as standing against the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in violation of all three federal constitutions, Article 4, which requires our trustees and employees to protect our persons and also forbids bills of attainder. Millions of Americans have been arrested and jailed under conditions imposed by this constructive fraud and false impersonation, unjustifiably taxed and harassed under the same false presumption of foreign citizenship obligations. Their property has been confiscated without compensation, false titles have been introduced and imposed upon their land and soil assets, and then used to enforce mortgages the American states and people never owed, and property and income tax taxation schemes that they likewise never owed, plus credit card and loan schemes that loaned them their own credit, based on their own assets. The principal trustees, the Pope and the Queen, stand in gross breach of trust, held responsible for the actions of the incorporated privateers that they have unleashed and allowed to act as predators upon us, in violation of our treaties, in violation of their respective constitutional agreements with us, and also in violation of the resulting commercial services contracts. They are presently engaged in what they euphemistically call a revenue, in which the above-described flip-flop of servicers results in the debts owed by the bankrupt municipal United States government becoming credits purportedly owed to the territorial government, but in fact, all credit and all underlying assets belong to the American states and people, and any revenue to the territorial government international sea jurisdiction must immediately pass through to their federation of states, the United States of America international land jurisdiction, and thence back home to the states and people where it belongs, together with all right, title and interest in their soil and land and all other physical assets, their homes, businesses, roads, factories, and natural resources, all lawful corporations chartered under their auspices, all patents, copyrights, trademarks, legal titles, stocks, bonds, certificates, pension funds and other intellectual property naturally belonging to them, all scrip issued on their credit, all gold, silver, and precious metals they are owed, all DNA collected from them, all identifications issued to them, and all other aspects of private and public property ownership that are rightfully theirs. All federal employees and subcontractors of any ilk whatsoever, including Interpol officers, like Mr. Stephen T. Mnuchin and Mr. Michael Pompeo, must come to heel and regurgitate the assets they have held onto for us all these years, or be proven nothing but international criminals and pirates engaged in piracy and other acts of non-consensual fraud and theft upon our shores. Mr. Stephen T. Mnuchin, as a public fiduciary and as a private fiduciary, has been and is hereby instructed to remove all municipal deposits being held or received to a pass-through account, the United States of America 1789, and from there to collect deposits owed to the United States of America 1787, including the state trusts styled as Ohio State, Wisconsin State, and so on, and to remove all those accounts, the municipal deposits, the territorial deposits, the federal state deposits, including the federal state trusts, and all franchise deposits thereof, to another pass-through account, the United States of America 1776, organized with one main international mercantile account, and 50 state sub-accounts, one each for each of the states of the Union. Mr. Stephen T. Mnuchin is hereby and in public instructed to faithfully and fully revenue all accounts and all property on deposit and all assets and paper representations of assets, including all American-based birth and baptismal certificates, gold, silver, and other assets of Americans on deposit with any and all branches of the United States Treasury, however styled or described, the DTCC, Federal Reserve, the IMF, World Bank, IBRD, BIS, or any other bank anywhere worldwide, to the ownership and control of the American depositors, their states, and their Federation of States, the United States of America unincorporated. We rely upon Mr. Mnuchin as referenced above and upon Mr. Donald J. Trump, acting in their offices as the comptrollers of the Exchange Stabilization Fund to accomplish and encourage the appropriate actions needed to repatriate American assets to America and to revenue those assets completely, all the way back to the American states and people that the assets and credit actually belong to. We likewise request and require the Joint Chiefs and their bankers to close all commercial banks within their system and to reopen them as mercantile banks under new management no later than June 17, 2020, and to do this as quietly and with as little disruption as possible. The revenue must be complete or it's not a revenue. Likewise, the Jubilee must be delivered to those it applies to, or it's not a Jubilee. You have our permission to arrest and confine all members of the Rothschild and Rockefeller families pending disposition of their cases. Encourage them to cooperate, and if they refuse, try them for their crimes against humanity before a military tribunal, and hang them. It's down to them or you.